Hello and welcome to Writing Winning Proposals, Advice from an Experienced Grant Reviewer, a webinar for VISTA members. I'm your host, Andy King. Our speaker today is Dennis Norris. Dennis has been a grant writer for many years, but also a grant reviewer for the Indiana Department of Education, the Toshiba Corporation, and also Scholastic Publishing Company in New York. He's a published author and national trainer on the topics of grant writing and grant management. And Dennis has served as the executive director of several large nonprofit organizations. Since 2009, Dennis has worked for the Central Asia Development Group, managing funding efforts for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Afghanistan and Western Africa. Dennis also serves as a facilitator for the VISTA Blend Resource Development course. A little later in our presentation, we will be hearing from Sarah Jordan Holcomb, a VISTA alum who recently completed her VISTA service with Mentor Greenville in Greenville, South Carolina, and who now is a development specialist with the Children's Museum of Upstate in Greenville. You'll also see Bethany DeSoblin and Andy Clark in the chat providing support and answering your questions along the way. So now let's take a look at the goals for our session. First, I want to say thanks to those of you who responded to our pre-webinar chat activity about the amount of experience you have with grant writing or proposal writing. Some of you identified potential funders through research. Others of you, it looks like you've been involved in writing grant proposals to different degrees. Some of you mentioned that you've already received funding, and some of you looks like you're still waiting to hear back on proposals that you've submitted. And it looks like some of you haven't even gotten your feet wet yet. But all of you have varying levels of experience with this topic of writing effective grant proposals. And during the webinar, we hope you can take away some information that'll be helpful as you continue to develop resources for your organization. So here's what we hope you'll get out for the webinar. By the end, we'd like you to be able to distinguish between a grant and a gift and shift your perspective about how to approach each of those. For times when it's appropriate, you'll be able to draft an effective letter of inquiry to express your organization's interest in receiving funding for a specific purpose. We also hope that you'll be able to appeal to grant reviewers by including the most effective information to make your grant proposal stand out from the rest, assuring the grant reviewer that your organization has what it takes to manage the project and their funds successfully. And finally, we hope that you'll view each proposal you submit as a learning opportunity, regardless of whether or not you get the funding. You'll see how a rejection can be a tremendous learning opportunity to help you get it right the next time. Okay, so that's what we hope you'll get out of today's session. Now, I'm going to turn things over to our presenter, Dennis Norris. Dennis?
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today, and I want to thank you for your time and participating. Learning about what grants are, how to obtain them, and how to have your proposal stand out to a grant reviewer is always an important topic, especially these days when the competition for grant dollars is at an all-time high. Please take a few seconds to respond to the chat question, what's your biggest fear about writing a grant proposal? Just enter your thoughts in the chat box and make sure you send to all participants so everyone can see.
All right, well, we've got lots of responses coming in already, ranging from fear of rejection, that is not getting funded. Some have expressed the concern that they're not even sure where to begin, that they don't know how to get started. The fear of being ignored, not getting any response whatsoever, not being taken seriously, fear of missing deadlines, or of not submitting a proposal that meets all the requirements, or sort of missing out on some of the instructions. For some, it seems complicated, or it seems like it may be more complex than they can actually take on. Some fear that their proposal might sound boring, or it might be uninspiring and might not lead to any interest from the funder. a fear of not sounding professional, not using proper grant language, being able to have the right writing abilities, being able to write effectively, to get the point across well, fear of jargon and having a technical language that would be important for an effective grant proposal. So lots and lots of different fears, but maybe these are ones that you've seen before, Dennis.
Yeah, so far really very interesting and diverse comments, especially the one that said grants make me look fat. So that's a little different than what we've seen before. But I think it's obvious that no matter what level of experience we may have, there is always fear or uneasiness surrounding the process. So I remember the first time I was asked to write a grant proposal. I had absolutely no idea what a grant was or what I was supposed to do. I asked around to people who I thought could help me, but instead of help, I got a lot of chuckles and many responses like, good luck with that. In the end, I just decided to follow the funder's directions, to keep it very simple, and to just spell out what it was that I wanted. The first few grants I wrote were funded, followed by a tremendously long dry spell, followed by a bit more success, and then another dry spell, and that's just how it goes. No one gets them all, but this webinar will boost your chances and provide you with a glimpse of what the other side, the side of the grant reviewer, looks for in a solid proposal. One thing is for certain, and I've seen this a little bit on the chats, if you don't submit grant proposals for funding, you have a 100% chance of failure. Hopefully this webinar will take some of the fear away and make you more competitive in obtaining funds. Okay, moving ahead, let's talk about the difference between a gift and a grant, because they are definitely not the same thing. And it is very important that you understand the difference between the two before you tackle a grant. Most gifts come from individual donors after they are solicited for it in some manner, a face-to-face solicitation, an email, snail mail, special event, whatever. Most money comes from middle to low income people, contrary to popular belief that you have to know a lot of rich people to raise money. Grants mainly come from foundations or sometimes from corporations. It is a transfer of money from a funding organization, or a funder, as I will call them throughout this presentation, to a qualified institution, a nonprofit organization for our purposes, to accomplish initiatives that may require specific duties and reporting. Grants are given quite often to explore creative approaches to existing problems or issues, like hunger or domestic violence or the environment, or to support approaches that have already been proven effective, like stem cell research, low-income housing construction, or veterans benefits. You have to write a proposal to get a grant, or at least some type of formal document that outlines your project and lists how you will measure your project's success. Gifts are also known as donations or charitable contributions, and often come after some relationship building has occurred. People are often drawn to a cause and want to give a donation to support a nonprofit's mission. Often gifts can be used for anything: salaries, programs, equipment, vehicles, operations, whatever. Grants are often referred to as contracts or agreements, so there's a difference there. Okay, a couple of last points about gifts versus grants. When you give a gift to a nonprofit organization, unless it is an anonymous gift, you will end up in their donor database. The nonprofit owns that list, and they cannot give or sell your name to another nonprofit unless you give them permission. When you get a grant from a foundation or corporation, that is public information. So I am able to see each grant that you've received and each grant that a funder has provided. Usually when you give a gift, you get an acknowledgement of some sort, and that usually has information on how you may write off the gift on taxes, in your taxes. With a grant, on the other hand, you get a binding legal contract that must be signed, returned, and adhered to throughout. In order to keep their tax status as a foundation, a funder must give away a portion of their income each year. And again, for this reason, all of their information is public and easily accessible. Board members, assets, grants given, how to contact, funding programs, etc. You must account for every penny, and you must measure the results of your grant project. So a formal binding contract is included when you are awarded a grant. Some are very long and detailed and require a lawyer to review, but some are just a simple letter with a paragraph or two. So again, why is this distinction between a gift and a grant so important? Number one, because the language used in seeking grants and gifts is very, very different. Number two, people give with their hearts first when making a gift. So fundraising and marketing materials intended to solicit gifts are written to strike a chord in a person's heart. Writing that attempts to pull on a donor's heartstrings is very appropriate in a fundraising appeal, but not in a grant proposal. And number three, a grant is a contractual business relationship. So grant correspondence should always be professional, clear, concise, and devoid of flowery or emotion-laden language. You want to convey to your potential funder that you are prepared to meet their philanthropic goals with your proposed project. So let's look at some examples of good gift solicitation language. The language used in asking for a gift should cause an emotional reaction or response. It should tug on the heartstrings. The examples on this slide are obviously attempting to evoke an emotional response and strike a chord with the donor. The writing attempts to make donors mad or sad or happy, whatever emotion does the job. Fundraising language is more salesy and is designed to market the mission of the organization. Smart nonprofits often have several marketing messages that are tied together and used throughout their various sources of media, like website, print, social media, or written materials. Examples of good grant language. Now, grant language is more professional, crisp, and clear. It is more business-centric and to the point. The examples on this slide are obviously not attempting to evoke an emotional response. Instead, we are presenting factual information in an effort to receive ongoing funding for our projects, whatever they are. We're not trying to sell anything here. We are trying to establish a partnership in which we do a project that yields specific results and a funder provides the money for that effort. So let's look at what makes grant reviewers smile. Making a grant reviewer smile has a lot to do with the content of your writing and the style in which you write it. Grant reviewers can tell through the writing of a letter of inquiry or a proposal whether or not the applicant is properly prepared for the task. If the writing is more for a fundraising than a grant, a reviewer will assume the applicant does not know the difference between the two, and the level of confidence will have been lost with that reviewer. If the language is businesslike and professional, the reviewer can tell that the applicant gets it and will maintain that understanding throughout the submission of reports and the stewardship of funds once they are received. If the structure of the proposal is haphazard and less than seamless, it is not hard for the reviewer to imagine that the management of the project will carry forward in the same way. Also, as a reviewer, it's fairly easy to tell when an applicant has bitten off more than they can chew. For instance, you cannot solve the world's hunger issue, but you might be able to help 300 people on the south side of your city. So if you want the grant reviewer to smile, you should never promise what you cannot deliver. And sticking with the issue of hunger, a grant reviewer will expect that you have a solid grasp on the problem. If you simply state that people are hungry in your city, that will make a reviewer suspicious that you may not have done your homework. Instead, if you provide solid and recent data on the problem and demonstrate that you have a deep understanding of the issue, you are once again instilling that very important level of confidence in the grant reviewer. Reactive versus proactive grant opportunities. There are really two types of grant opportunities that I often refer to as number one, reactive, or number two, proactive. Reactive grant opportunities come in the form of a request for proposals or periodic grant competitions for which the guidelines have been set and the problem or issue has already been identified. You react to them by submitting your application, knowing that your program must fit within their strict guidelines and standards. Proactive grant opportunities, on the other hand, are much different. These are ongoing opportunities from funders that are in line with their philanthropic goals, and unlike reactive grant opportunities, they are not specific, time-centric grant competitions. Proactive opportunities always exist, but you have to be proactive in finding them and researching whether or not their goals fit those of your program. So again, reactive grant opportunities generally come with a complete set of instructions. You will have to make sure your program fits into these often very tight parameters. There is usually a deadline, after which proposals are reviewed and a winner is declared. After that, the grant opportunity is either not repeated or it is changed for the next cycle. Proactive grant opportunities will be much less directive, often asking for either a letter of inquiry, which we'll call an LOI, or proposal to get the ball rolling. Once an LOI is received, you may be asked to prepare a proposal. It too will have a deadline, but it usually coincides with board or committee meetings of the funder. Proposals are reviewed at each board or committee meeting, and one or more applicants are chosen to receive funds. Sometimes the funder may request that you alter your project approach somewhat, and they will give you another chance to submit for their next deadline. This is fine because with proactive grants, the deadlines are cyclical, usually quarterly, semi-annually, etc., and the philanthropic goals seldom change. Okay, we're going to take a look at some examples to make this a bit more clear. Let's look at reactive grant opportunities, some examples here. United Ways across the nation typically have reactive grant programs. This one, located in central Indiana, is called Youth as Resources. Communities give to their United Way each year, and a portion of that funding goes to programs like this. Programs may last for several years or be just a one-time offer. Either way, United Ways are always a good source for reactive grants. This one states the following. Youth as Resources awards grants to youth volunteer groups for youth-led service projects. Grant workshops are conducted before each grant deadline to advise youth on how to apply. Boone County Youth as Resources has an application deadline of January 22nd, 2016. The dates for their grant workshops are listed on their website. Please RSVP to confirm your attendance. The amounts for these grants are dependent upon how much the United Way was able to raise in the previous campaign. Okay, proactive grant opportunities, an example. Lilly Endowment, on the other hand, is an excellent example of a proactive grant funder. It is a nonprofit organization funded through investments made by the Eli Lilly Pharmaceutical Company. Eli Lilly was an astute businessman, but he was also a very religious and philanthropic individual. The endowment is separate from the business, and it was the Lilly family who decided what areas of interest they would fund through grants. They had to list these interests when they initially applied for their status with the IRS. The broad areas of funding for this type of foundation remain constant, though the specific types of programming they support can change over time. A few of their broad funding areas include religion, education, and community development. They have a board of directors that meets quarterly and separate committees that make funding decisions. Their deadlines never change and are consistent with their board or funding committee meetings. In the case of Lilly Endowment, these are quarterly. They have program officers to help applicants through their processes. Lilly Endowment, like most foundations offering proactive grants, will not announce their grant programs because they are not set competitions for focusing on a singular topic. Instead, you must be proactive and research institutions like Lilly Endowment. You do this in a variety of ways through grant research. Your research will reveal foundations whose philanthropic interests match your own and will include instructions for approaching them. These instructions may include a phone call, an email, an LOI, or even a proposal as an initial approach. So let me give you another example of a proactive grant opportunity in which I was personally involved, Project Croak.
Dennis, this is Andy. Before we move on, a couple of questions have come in that I think might be helpful if we cover them now.
Okay.
So if you'll indulge me. And these relate back to the fundraising language versus grant language.
Okay.
So, one question is, what do you do if the funder poses questions, and I'm guessing this is in the request for proposals, questions that indicate they would like to see the passion behind the organization's work? She says, I've been working on microgrants, and they tend to ask questions like, why do you do this work? What motivates your organization? So with questions like that, could you use language that tugs on heartstrings?
Well, yes, I think in a mild sort of way to answer that best. What you don't want to do is include language that where you're trying to sell somebody. In this particular example, this person is not asking you to sell them. They're asking, what is your passion? What is the passion of your mission? And I think that you can relate that in very professional terms. What you don't want to do is, the we can save the world with the exclamation point. Okay, that's fundraising language, and that doesn't belong in anything related to an LOI or a grant. So again, to summarize, if someone's asking for a passionate description of what you do, I would still use very, very crisp, clear, professional language. You might have to describe a little bit in passionate terms what you do, but I would stay very, very clear of the fundraising language.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. And a couple of folks have noted in the chat that some of the content's going by very quickly for them, so we'll see if maybe we can find a couple places to pause as we go along, but I know you've got a lot to cover and a lot of great info, so back to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to slow it down a little bit, but as Andy said, we have a lot to cover here. We left off with Project CROAK, and Project CROAK stands for Creeks, Rivers, Oceans, and Kids. At one point, I wrote grants for a large school district in Indianapolis. And one day I was approached by a group of third-grade teachers who said they had a desire for more computers in their classroom. My response to them was, okay, well, name me one other third-grade class that doesn't have the same desire. In other words, they simply wanted a gift of computers, and they were probably not going to get one, especially in a public school district. Instead of a desire for computers, we had to come up with a creative approach to an existing problem, which, remember, is the definition of a grant, for which the acquisition of computers would be a peripheral byproduct. Luckily, that very same year, their school was given a curriculum emphasis of environmental science, so that everything they taught, from math to spelling to science, emphasized the environment. And luckily, a creek ran behind their school. So one day we walked to the creek, and I asked them, how can we capitalize on the good fortune of having an environmental emphasis school with a creek running behind it? And that's when Project CROAK was born. The creek is part of a watershed leading to the Gulf of Mexico. So we set up partner schools along the watershed. And at the beginning of the year, a fictitious frog was released into the creek. During the school year, kids along the watershed would report on what it was about their segment of the watershed that could hurt or help the frog as he made his way downstream. There were two problems we sought to address with this project. Number one, kids needed to learn at an earlier age the interconnectivity of the environment, or the fact that throwing trash into the creek ultimately affects everyone who lives along the creek. And number two, kids needed to learn at an earlier age how to work and learn in teams, and there was plenty of research to back up our claims. So how did we get started with Project CROAK? Well, I did some grant research, and I was looking for funders who had as their philanthropic interest the partnering with public schools and the teaching of children about the environment. I located the National Environmental Education and Training Foundation in Washington, D.C., whose philanthropic interest matched our project perfectly. Their instructions included an LOI as the initial approach. So I wrote an LOI using a non-fundraising, business-centered writing style, striving to stay very clear and concise above all else. This project could be described as cute and fun, but we didn't want our writing to be cute or fun. So what happened? The project was first funded by the National Environmental Education and Training Foundation, and after that, IBM even offered to buy it from us. Project CROAK won a national award for project creativity and implementation, and it led to another project called the Signals Project, and that led to the JASON Project, which is tied to Dr. Robert Ballard, the gentleman who discovered the Titanic. In the end, there were millions put into the school district, and the JASON Project was moved to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. Needless to say, the third-grade teachers and all of the third-grade partner schools got more computers than they knew what to do with. In fact, the desire for computers became almost forgotten as teachers really got into the project and the problems we were solving. This is a really good example of how a proactive grant opportunity and the business relationship it generated can lead to greater things. It all started with the desire of an unconditional gift, which they were not going to get. Instead, we created a project that could not be implemented without computers, and we sought and obtained funding for that project. Okay, so let's walk through the grant application process that I followed. You have 5 seconds to look this over, and then we're going to have a quiz. And I'm just kidding. This application process looks a little bit complicated, but it's anything but. It's actually very simple and can be boiled down to something like this. Okay, through your grant research, you identify your funder and ensure their philanthropic goals meet the parameters of your project. Next, you simply follow their directions. If they want you to call them, call them. If they want you to email them a synopsis of your project, then email them. More than likely, they will ask you to write an LOI. Sometimes they will skip the LOI and ask you for a full proposal. Since these two options will be about 95% of what you see, we will focus in this webinar on both the LOI and the full proposal. And once you are successful in obtaining the grant, you will receive a notice of the award, and then you are free to implement your project with your new business partner. Okay, we're going to start with the LOI. As mentioned, the vast majority of funders out there will ask you for an LOI. Throughout these next sections, I'm going to explain what a grant reviewer expects to see, but I'm also going to tell you how to make that particular section exceptional in their eyes. An LOI is exactly that, a letter of inquiry to a potential funder asking whether or not they are interested in your project and want to see more of it through a full proposal. Trying to impress a funder with fancy writing, jargon, or flowery adjectives will only annoy them. LOIs should be razor sharp in focus and content with no extra words. The first paragraph should say it all and then be briefly supported by the rest of the letter. Exceptional LOIs can be read and completely understood by the reviewer in mere seconds. Remember, funders read hundreds of these things, and the way to make yours stand out is to be brief and clear. You are trying to make your way into the first cut. Your program will have measurable objectives, and your grant reviewer will want to see that you understand this. Your LOI then should very briefly include these and how they will be achieved. You don't have to be extremely detailed in an LOI. Just show your reviewer that you understand that measurable objectives are the most important part of your project. And don't forget the purpose of an LOI. You are not asking for funds. You are asking for the opportunity to submit a proposal. You will mention how much money you want, of course, but the reason for an LOI is to interest the funder in your submission of a full proposal. Today, we are fortunate to have Sarah Jordan Holcomb with us, a former Vista, who has had some recent success with her LOI. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. My services at Vista focus primarily on helping Mentor Greenville expand its program offerings by securing funding. I wrote a lot of LOIs, and when invited, I submitted full grant proposals. These are some of the things I did to prepare myself to write an LOI. I collected and reviewed my organization's previously funded and denied grant requests. I read through them for the purpose of learning the language the organization used to speak about itself, but also to try and identify what projects were successful or unsuccessful. Through this process, I did see a need for putting in place a filing system to organize past grants and highlight future grants to go for. I connected with grant reviewers. If available, see if you can sit with reviewers while they are processing grants so you can hear the kinds of things that they are looking for and the kinds of questions they ask. In my case, because our organization is an affiliate of the United Way, there are grant review meetings that happen and I was able to sit in. I also researched grantors' past giving and requirements for an LOI or a proposal. It helped to see if they were interested in funding general operating because we were restructuring our mentor program at the time, and we were looking for that. I did this via their website, but I also did this by looking up their 990 on guidestar.org. I found section 15 and the pages listing the previous year's giving, amount granted, and support type to be the most helpful. Dennis will speak more about the 990 later in the presentation. Another important tip is to make contact with a representative at the funding agency. Don't be afraid to contact someone from the granting organization before you submit your LOI. It's also a good idea for you to be on their radar. For instance, I asked questions about what models they prefer. Are they partial to outcomes-based models, or would they be willing to fund something that doesn't have strict research detailing outcomes and is experimental in nature? I have also asked loads of questions about outcomes, goals, and objectives. Some organizations have strict thoughts about these words, so you may want to make sure you're using their verbiage when you write. Which brings me to my last point. Use language of the grantor to describe your program. For example, if a grantor states that their mission is to support innovative and creative educational programs, then the words innovative and creative educational programs should be found in your LOI or your proposal.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And just a little bit about Sarah. She completed her VISTA service in August 2015 and served with the United Way of Greenville County's partnering organization, Mentor Greenville, in Greenville, South Carolina. Her VISTA position focused on grant writing and volunteer recruitment. And Sarah currently works at the Children's Museum of the Upstate in Greenville, South Carolina as their development associate. So thanks, Sarah. Now let's take a quick quiz. What do you do if the funder's instructions are to, quote unquote, write a proposal? Should you A, submit a letter of inquiry, B, write a narrative about your project, C, submit a standard proposal format, or D, send an email to the funder and ask what they want? So while you're thinking about your answer, remember that a grant reviewer really does want to fund your program if it falls in line with their philanthropic goals. But a reviewer's job is to separate those applicants who instill confidence for their potential in actually carrying out their program from those who do not. So what other way do they have to determine this other than your writing? If you do not have a basic understanding of the difference between a gift and a grant, and if you do not write your LOIs and proposals with clear and concise writing, then why would a funder take a chance on you in meeting your objectives and managing their money? Let's say you're an investor and you ask two individuals with the same basic idea to come in and make a presentation to you. The first person comes in dressed in a suit and tie, presents his program in a very organized and sequential manner, and leaves behind a positive impression. The second person shows up in jeans and a t-shirt, props his feet up on your desk, and rambles incoherently about what he wants to do with your money. Which person is most likely to earn your confidence and obtain your investment? Okay. The correct answer to the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is Bethany. We have a lot of answers in the chat, so it looks like we've got a pretty wide variety there. So I just wanted to let you know that that's where to find what people said.
Okay, terrific. I'm looking through those now. So you're right, we do have a lot of different responses. So the correct answer to the quiz is C, submit a standard proposal format. So what the heck is that? That's what I'm going to show you now. But first, it is critical to remember this. Whenever a funder provides you instructions on what to write and how to write it, those must be followed to the letter. And this came up in the question earlier about the showing your passion. If they're asking for that, then show them a little bit of passion. Everything you are about to learn after this is not applicable when the funder provides instructions. Instructions trump everything, okay? In the absence of instructions, which will be the norm, by the way, there is a loose industry standard that you can follow. So when a funder asks for a quote-unquote proposal, that typically means a 10-page document with certain elements. And I will talk about these elements in the next section of slides. If they ask for a 5-page proposal or a 3-page or a 7-page or whatever, it still needs all of the elements, but you must reduce them proportionally. There will normally be no mention of a page count. So again, a 10-page proposal is an industry standard that you will be safe to follow. So let's look at a standard 10-page proposal. More and more these days, you will see that a funder does not want to speak to you, does not want you to email them, but does in fact want either an LOI or a proposal as the initial approach. It's not that they are unfriendly, but you are competing with many other people and the volume is just too heavy. If you make it through the first cut, then it is more likely that you will have an actual person with whom you can speak. Most people in this field agree that a proposal must have certain elements, but you may hear them called different terms. For instance, instead of a need statement, you may see problem statement. Instead of methods, you may see activities. These are all pretty interchangeable. So a standard 10-page proposal usually consists of the elements you see here within the page parameters you see here. Are these page parameters set in stone? No. But if you choose not to even loosely follow this framework, you will quickly find yourself in that lack of confidence pile on the reviewer's desk. For instance, the methods section of a proposal is the meat of your program. If you only write half a page on what you plan to do and then write 3 pages of introduction, for instance, then your proposal is way out of proportion and it will become obvious to the reviewer that you do not understand which sections hold the most importance to them. So let's look at each one of these sections individually. The first is the executive summary, 1 page. The executive summary is the cover page of a proposal, explaining to the funder in brief terms who you are, what you want, and what you plan to use their funding for. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it mimics the LOI, and the two can be somewhat interchangeable. An executive summary, however, should be a bit more expansive. For instance, after your first informative paragraph, your executive summary should flow easily into a paragraph of need statement, followed by a couple paragraphs of your measurable objectives and the methods to support them. These middle paragraphs are where you would expand a bit, making the executive summary different from an LOI. And finally, the executive summary will have a good ending paragraph that encapsulates your program. An executive summary can also be used later as the framework for press releases or marketing tools. But don't be fooled. An executive summary is typically the last thing written in a grant proposal, but it's the first thing and quite often the only thing read by a reviewer, at least in their first pass. If you don't write a good, crisp, easy-to-read executive summary, chances are you will go no further. When I write a proposal, I usually set it down for a few days when I'm finished, and then I go back and write the executive summary with fresh eyes. I agonize over these things because I want my words to be laser-focused. Why? Because I know, and now so do you, that the executive summary is either going to open that gate for me or close it. And, of course, I want to make it through that first cut so I can walk through that gate and get one step closer to the grant. The second part is the introduction, again, 1 page. Use the introduction to get acquainted with or to shake hands with your funder. Tell them who you are and why you exist. If you are here to help single mothers, then briefly tell the grant reviewer why that is so important. Show why your organization is relevant to the community. If there is an award your organization has received or a major grant it has obtained, then tell the reviewer about it. Don't be shy. But if you are an organization serving single mothers and you want an award for the best tug-of-war team at the annual picnic, you'll want to leave that out. However, if your organization serves single mothers and your board is made up of 1/3 previous clients, then that is something really important to mention. So in other words, introduce yourself, but stay relevant to the grant for which you are applying. This is your opportunity to overlap your project goals with the philanthropic goals of the funder. The next section is the goal statement or objectives, which is usually a half page. The goal statement and measurable objectives are the most important part of any proposal. A goal is a desired result that a person or an organization envisions, plans, and commits to achieve. A goal is something that is ambitious but still achievable. For instance, a goal may be to reduce the number of homeless individuals in your community. The goal doesn't go into specifics, but it clearly says what you intend to accomplish. Objectives are smaller scale outcomes that add up to the overall goal. They define strategies or implementation steps to attain the goal and are specific, measurable, and have a defined completion date. Your objectives will allow you to accurately measure the effectiveness of your program towards the attainment of that goal. Objectives then serve as your roadmap. These are the things you will measure in your approach to the problem or issue. The funder gives you money because he or she believes you can reach your objectives with your creative approach. Objectives are important because if you are successful, the funder has not only met its own philanthropic goal, but perhaps your program can be replicated and the entire community will continue to improve based on your approach. A good example of this would be cancer stem cell research. At some point, a funder took a chance on this creative approach to the problem of cancer. And once this proved to be a successful approach, more and more funding became available and the process of stem cell research was repeated and enhanced. So, exceptional objectives are those that do a very good job of measuring because this makes the process of replicating or even not replicating that much more important. Remember, Thomas Edison tried 1,000 different ways to make a light bulb, and when asked about his success, he placed the emphasis on his failures because he learned of 999 ways not to make a light bulb. Our next section then is the need statement, which is typically a page and a half. The need statement or problem statement shows the funder that you've done your homework and you know what you're talking about. So going back to Project Croak, remember that the initial desire was for more computers, something that every third grade teacher in America has a desire for. We turn that desire around to focus on two problems existing in the field of environmental education for children. Aesthetically, when you write a need statement, it's best to form an inverted wedge or an upside-down triangle by presenting your findings on a wider scale, then honing it down to a regional or statewide scale, and then honing it down one step further to show how the problem affects you locally or even how your problem affects a single individual. With Project Croak, I started with a national environmental education statistic and a quote from a famous scientist about why environmental education is so important. Then I showed a graphic from the Indiana Department of Education on how team learning was more effective than individual learning. After that, I looked at the individual schools' statewide scores in both math and science, which were low, and tried to incorporate an increase in those scores into my objectives. I did not paint a picture of such gloom and doom that the proposal reviewer would think, oh my gosh, this problem is unsolvable. But I did have solid research backing up my claims, and I presented it all in a very graphical and easy to understand manner. My 1.5-page needs assessment looks somewhat like a miniature research paper, complete with footnotes and quotes. Also, avoid the jargon of your profession. Don't assume that your grant reviewer knows the terms and vocabulary of your field. Most likely they do not. Okay, the method statement section, 4 pages usually, the bulk of your proposal. And remember how all this started with your project. You said something like, what if we did this? Well, that's what the method section is. It's your plan. This will be the bulk of your proposal, as I mentioned, about 4 pages. A method section maps out each step of the way for your project. What you will do the first day, the first week, the first year. Each method you propose must always lead to the completion of one of your objectives. Again, going back to Project Croak, my method section was quite expansive. I listed all of the partner schools along the watershed, inserted a timeline as to when the frog was scheduled to appear in their section of the watershed, explained in detail what was expected of each school, and then told the funder how we would produce a comprehensive CD of the project when it was completed. The method section can also include a brief introduction of the primary personnel involved in the implementation and management of the program, further instilling confidence in your funder, especially if the personnel are exceptionally qualified or have managed grants in the past. Also, periodic measurements of the project's progress can be explained in the method section. Here again, we did this with Project Croak after each partner school's participation. This way we could tell whether or not our measurable objectives were in line. Next we have the evaluation section, which is typically 1 page. It is best defined as the method by which you will measure your objectives. What instrument will you use to determine your level of success or failure? Evaluations include pre-test and post-test, surveys, knowledge gains, and several different methods that really depend upon the type of program you are implementing. Evaluation should tie into both the needs statement and, of course, the objectives. In the needs statement, you have shown that you understand the problem by presenting current and reliable resources. The measurement of your objectives should add to the field in some manner. Perhaps your project will be so successful that someday another grant writer cites your fundings in his or her needs statement. Evaluation should include a brief example, an explanation, as to how you plan to get the word out on what you've done. For example, a white paper may be produced that you post on your website and that of your funder. However this is done, it will be your responsibility to disseminate your findings so that others may see what does and even what does not work. Your funder will want to know whether or not you met your objectives, and they will want you to spread the word about your project. From both an educational and marketing standpoint, it's good for both of you. So feel free to add some creativity to your evaluation as long as it gets the job done. For example, do online pre and post tests as opposed to paper tests, or use an unbiased third party to perform interviews of clients. Finally, don't be worried if you miss the mark on your objectives. I have often used this fact to produce more funding. I do this by explaining to the funder that my objectives were off due to reasons X, Y, and Z. If I alter my objectives and make them more realistic, then perhaps we can accomplish what we set out to do from the start. Sometimes the funder will agree with this strategy and give you a continuance on your funding. Remember, this is a business relationship. In real life, goals are missed all the time, and investors simply readjust their expectations. It is no different with a grant. The next section is future and existing funding, usually a half page. It's very important for you to relate to your funder that you do not see them as your sole investor for all of eternity. They will want to know if you have sought other funding, someone with whom they can share the load. If not, they will want to know how you plan to sustain your project over time with more grants, private donations, etc. Your method for sustainability is important, yes, but not as important as acknowledging to your funder that you get it and that you understand that one day their funding will go away. Also, don't forget to tell your funder if in-kind contributions are included by you or others. For example, consulting services, facilities, equipment, or anything that has a value associated with it other than real dollars. And that brings us to budget and budget narrative, usually a page and a half. Be sure your budget accurately reflects the activities of your project. Don't include budget items that are strictly forbidden by the funder. If that information is not known, then you can assume any category may be funded, like salaries, consultant fees, supplies, insurance, etc. Always prepare a brief paragraph explaining the numbers. You don't have to be extremely detailed because the numbers speak for themselves, but having a text-based explanation often helps the reviewer understand what you want. Unless directed otherwise, it's always best to separate those costs associated with personnel, like salaries, consultant fees, and taxes, from those not associated with personnel, like supplies, postage, vehicles, etc. This practice just makes for a clean, well-segmented budget that is easier to understand. Okay, so some tips for grant submission. Whenever I review for grants, I am told to disregard any proposal whose authors clearly did not follow directions. I have seen proposals come in on 30-weight marble paper with unreadable fonts, in binders, in a box with a flower, you name it. Trying to impress a grant reviewer will only annoy him or her. After hours upon hours upon hours of reading the same thing, an annoyed grant reviewer is not in your best interest. So, in the absence of instructions, you are safe following the directions above. Finally, and this may seem like a minor point, but it is most definitely is not. If you do not know the standard rules of desktop publishing, you should learn them and follow them religiously. For example, one of these rules is to left justify everything rather than block justify when it comes to your text. I don't know if you've ever tried to read 100 proposals that are block justified, where one line might have 3 words on it and the next line 50 words, but doing so will exhaust you very quickly and leave you with a tremendous headache. A grant reviewer is a human being, and if the focus is taken off of your words and instead placed on how difficult they are to read, then you have a pretty big problem on your hands. So again, learn Desktop Publishing 101 and follow the rules in everything you write. There is a wonderful resource for this that I will show you in a minute. We're going to hear briefly from Sarah again, and with some tips about proposal writing. Sarah.
During my VISTA service, Mentor Greenville identified a need for mental health counseling for the students that they worked with. This idea morphed into securing scholarships for the students to access mental health counselors. After an LOI and being invited to submit a full proposal, I used resources to help me draft the grant that would ultimately provide scholarships for the students. The resources I used came from a couple of places. I began with shapingoutcomes.org. I mentioned this earlier. Funders really use the words objectives, outcomes, and goals interchangeably, so it's good to know and go to this resource and learn about those words and how to use them correctly. I also use Network for Good. They have great webinars and info on all things nonprofit. Another thing that I found very helpful was the complete book of grant writing by Nancy Burke Smith and E. Gabriel Wirtz. This book actually contains two examples of grant writing, two examples of LOIs, and also instruction on how to compile an entire grant. This was given to me by another grant writer, and I continue to use this book. I also use the Foundation Center, and Dennis will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Another thing I would recommend is get fresh eyes on your proposal. Ask someone removed from the project to read the LOI or the grant. Fresh eyes will be able to identify any holes or anything that doesn't make sense with your writing. Also, have a solid, feasible sustainability plan. Money is tight, and grantors want to know that the effect of their giving will last beyond the funding cycle. Make sure you speak to how the program will continue once their funding is used. An example from my own experience is with a local grantor we asked to help start the mental health center. Within this after-school program, those students in our mentor program attended. This particular grantor is very specific about the sustainability plan. It's literally the make or break for the funding. So I worked with local counselors and universities to create a sustainability plan that not only kept the center going, but helped out counselors seeking extra certifications. By offering their counseling services at no cost, counselors received hours toward their extra certifications, and the children received mental health counseling that they needed. The grantor loved it, and the project is working well. If reapplying or applying for a proven program, send photos, examples of work, quotes, anything that you have found from your work. These are great, and thank you letters as well. Quotes from participants to strengthen a proposal, in addition to any research or findings from your program. If your request is denied, ask if you can speak with someone from the committee to learn how to strengthen your proposal for the next round. While working with Mentor Greenville, we applied for a grant that we didn't receive. When I thanked the grantor for their time and asked for feedback, I got a phone call from the agency explaining that they preferred third-party evaluations versus in-house evaluations. I often found that granting organizations were more open to talking to me as a VISTA versus someone who was an employee of my organization. Always approach feedback as a learning opportunity. Many people in the community know VISTAs are learning about grant writing. They are honing these skills, and so they were always welcome. They always welcomed my questions. And lastly, use your library. Some libraries have nonprofit series where trained individuals come in and speak on a plethora of topics relating to nonprofits, such as grant writing, grant researching, donor retention, creating a successful volunteer corps, lots of different topics. Libraries may also have subscriptions to grant databases, such as foundationcenter.org or grants.gov. These are a couple of my tips.
Great. Thanks again, Sarah, for your tips and information. Very, very helpful. Okay, so what happens when you're funded? If you are funded, be sure that the funder has not altered your proposal in any way, especially the measurable objectives. For instance, if they want to add an objective that you were not even considering, then you need to determine whether or not this additional objective will cost money, and if so, how much. Or they may want to fund everything except for the consultant you need for your project, for instance. If that is the case, then you may need to alter some of your objectives and or evaluation and find this money elsewhere or take it out completely. This kind of thing does not happen often, but it does happen. So be sure your proposal is being funded in its entirety as it was submitted. Read your grant agreement very carefully. It can sometimes be a complicated document, so have a lawyer read it as well if that's the case. You will have to sign a contract. If you do not like the terms, negotiate them. If you cannot come to terms, then turn down the grant. Sounds painful, I know, but not as painful as trying to implement a grant project that looks nothing like what you submitted. Be a good steward of the funds. Some examples of this are, number one, invite your funders to activities associated with your program, like special events, graduations, grand openings, etc. Number two, stay in constant communication with your funder. If you're communicating too much, don't worry, they'll tell you. Number three, submit your reports on time and maintain a positive working relationship with your funder. Number four, account for every single penny. If you need to adjust your budget, check with the funder first. And lastly, remember, the philanthropic world is very, very small. They all know each other and they all talk to each other. If you are a good steward of grant funds, word will get around and you will benefit from that solid reputation. And finally, remember, this is a grant, not a gift. There will be more accountability in the measurement of objectives. It's okay to be appreciative of the funding you receive, but always conduct yourself in a very transparent and business-like manner. And then, if you are not funded, there's other things you can do if you're not funded. Of course, not being funded feels like the end of the world, but it can be a valuable learning tool, as Sarah mentioned. Always take the opportunity to thank the funder for their consideration of your proposal and request that they send you information as to why that decision was made. Sometimes they will even copy the evaluator sheets and send them to you. Sarah mentioned this one already, and they were more than willing to provide the feedback she asked for. After you look these over, you may decide to try again. That is a perfect chance to reconnect with the funder to see if that is permissible. Of course, complaining about the funder does no good at all. It may cause you harm. Remember, it's not personal. The philanthropic world is a very small world. I try to view the rejection of a grant proposal as a really good edit of my project by unbiased outside individuals. Perhaps the reviewers all saw some programmatic gap that I did not, or perhaps I have bitten off more than I can chew with my proposal. Whatever the case, being able to see grant reviewers' notes is an incredibly smart thing to do. Personally, on those occasions when I have not been awarded a grant, I have never once been told by a funder that I could not see the reviewer's notes. So let's talk about resources. Let's look at some resources that are available to you now that you know more about what a grant reviewer wants to see. There are some resources on the Vista campus to help you with the researching portion of grant writing, and these are valuable tools in locating both reactive and proactive grant opportunities. A good resource is the Researching Grants tutorial, where you can learn where to find local and national grant resources. It is packed with information to help you locate potential grants. There is also a webinar entitled Researching Grants, Finding the Right Opportunities for Your Project. This recorded webinar focuses on grant research and relationship building, and it explores different techniques for finding grant opportunities that meet your organization's specific needs through real-world stories from Vista members. In my opinion, the best resource for grant research and information is the Foundation Center at foundationcenter.org. Not only can you search through the Foundation Center online database, where you can find virtually any existing grant opportunity, but you can also engage in tutorials, read several articles, and employ sample tools to help you along the way. GrantSpace at grantspace.org is another excellent resource that offers information specifically designed to meet the needs of grant seekers. GrantSpace, by the way, is a site run by the Foundation Center, and so it has the same high caliber of information. And in my opinion, GuideStar.org is a close second to the Foundation Center in terms of being an effective grant resource, but you have to dig a little bit. GuideStar gathers and disseminates information about nonprofits, which includes their IRS 990 tax forms, which Sarah has already mentioned. An IRS Form 990 is a lengthy tax form that every nonprofit agency must complete each year. It is full of information that is all public record. When you look at a 990, you immediately get that IRS form butterfly in the pit of your stomach because it appears to be horribly complicated. But it's actually very simple, and there's really only one place you need to go, and that's Section 15. It is there you will learn whether or not the nonprofit received any grants in that fiscal year, who the grants were from, and how much they were for. Looking at the 990s of your competitors is perfectly legal and acceptable, and it's an excellent way to develop a long list of funders interested in your mission and the similar missions of your colleagues as well. If you're smart, you will find out who is doing the same kind of work as you. Go to GuideStar.org and take a peek at their 990s. I do it all the time. GrantsAlert.com is another place to find education grants, and in my experience has the most expansive and comprehensive listing of those. And finally, grants.gov is a place to find federal grants. Don't be afraid of federal grants. For any one federal program, there is often an army of individuals called program officers ready to assist you. And for very large federal programs, there are usually introductory or instructional webinars like this one, or instructional videos, and sometimes even day-long conferences held in major cities for potential applicants. Federal grants are often the largest grants available, and yes, you will have to work a bit harder for those. But in the end, after having received and managed several large, multi-million-dollar federal grants, and some from other countries like Canada and Australia, I find that they are well worth the effort. Earlier I mentioned a desktop publishing resource, and here it is. The PC is not a typewriter, or the Mac is not a typewriter, depending on which format you use. I have to say that this little book is packed with so much valuable information that it's worth every bit of the $10 or so that I spent on it. I bet I pick this book up every 6 months just to check on something, so I recommend it to you. Okay, so what are our next steps? What can we do right now, today, at your organization to get started on obtaining grants? Well, besides finding the right funders for your projects, here are some suggestions. First, write an introduction of your nonprofit using grant language as opposed to fundraising language. At some point, you're going to need this, so why not do it now? Secondly, you all know the missions of your organizations, so dust off the old term paper skills and start doing some research. What national or international data best identifies the problem or issue your mission seeks to remedy? What might this data look like on a more statewide or regional scale? List some examples of how this plays out locally. Here again, eventually you will need this data and you will have to keep it updated. No better time to start than the present. And lastly, finally, I'm sure you all have a project or two in mind. What are your rather lofty but achievable goals for these projects? Can you write out 3 or 4 measurable objectives that lead toward the attainment of your goals? A good rule of thumb is to ask yourself whether or not your measurable objectives will add to the field of study surrounding your mission. So thank you for your time today. It's been a great chance to get to talk to you, and I certainly hope you're walking away from this webinar not only with some valuable grant writing information, but also with a glimpse of what a grant reviewer is expecting from you. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Sarah Jordan, for sharing so much information with us today. We're about to see what questions we have from the audience, but before we do, I want to invite everyone to share your thoughts about this presentation today. You can see the evaluation poll has opened on the right side of your screen. 10 questions where you can quickly share your feedback about this webinar and give us some thoughts or ideas about other topics you'd like to see in future webinars. So while you're filling out the evaluation poll, we're going to get to your questions. And there are 2 ways that you can ask questions. Already a number of you have submitted questions online through the Q&A feature. And now that the poll is open, the Q&A panel is just above the poll on the right side of the screen. So if you want to ask a question at this point, click the triangle next to the letters Q and A. That Q&A panel will open. You can submit your question electronically. And now I'm going to invite our operator, Tyler, to come back to give us instructions for asking questions on the phone. Tyler?
Yes, indeed. If you are on the phone and would like to ask a question, please unmute your phone first, press *1 and record your name. I do require a name to introduce your question. If you'd like to withdraw your question from the queue, you can press *2. But again, to ask a question, please unmute your phone first, press *1 and record your name. It does take a few moments for questions to come through, however, so please stand by.
Okay, and while we're waiting for questions to come in on the phone, we've got plenty of questions here that came in through the Q&A. So first off, we've got a group of questions for you, Dennis, that relate to the standard proposal format.
Okay.
And a couple of folks were astute and recognized that it's 10 pages, not including the executive summary, so the total is actually
Correct.
11 pages. So if anyone was wondering about that, we'll just get that out of the way. So you mentioned the resource on using word processing. Computer's not a typewriter. But there were some questions about things like line spacing and margin size and all of that. So I don't know if you want to say anything more specific about that, or to, just give them this sort of standard guidelines about spacing and all the rest.
Sure. I would. I love these. I love desktop publishing questions, because once you know a little bit about desktop publishing, everything that you see, you just become this monster. Oh, this is wrong. That's wrong, and it's good and it's bad, I guess. But very good point on the executive summary. Almost always the executive summary does not count as part of the page count. It's just the document that lays on top of the proposal. So that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. In terms of desktop publishing, you're safe all the time with a Times New Roman font, 12-point font, if you're not directed to use anything else. But the more important aspects of desktop publishing have to do with things like for instance, there's only one space after a period. Back in the typewriter days, you would do two spaces to separate the end of the sentence from the beginning of the sentence, but computers do that separation for you automatically. So when you do two spaces, it kind of messes everything up. And then there's other things like an M-EM, which is that very close hyphenated section of a sentence that separates an idea from the main idea. These are all in that little booklet. And if you know these things, it's very valuable to you. They talk about how to use margins properly. They talk about this thing called widows and orphans, which is an explanation to not leave words dangling at the end of a paragraph. And like I said in the presentation, it might seem like a small thing to you, but it's not. It has to do with years and years of research on how human beings read and what exhausts the eyes and things like that. So you want your grant reviewer to be very comfortable with reading your LOI or proposal and not get exhausted. So I would highly recommend that resource.
Okay, great. And then like standard 1-inch margins around and single spacing for the text.
Correct, unless you're directed otherwise.
Okay, super. So then someone asked the question, is there such a thing as too many statistics? You had mentioned it's important to, back up your statements, especially around the need statement. Is there a limit? Like, how will we know if we're pelting the reviewer with too many numbers?
This is a very good question as well, because it's sort of like an art. To know exactly what statistics to put in and how to present them. If you ever have the opportunity to be a grant reviewer, you should do that, because you have to really put yourself in that person's shoes. Are you going to sit and read a table full of numbers after having read 100 of the same thing? Probably not. But if you put those numbers in a really cool looking pie chart or something along those lines, it's much easier to read. It's much better for you. It makes the grant reviewer smile, like I said earlier. So and these are usually going to come up in a needs statement, and it's best to mix things up. You have a very important quote and some statistics and some graphics, and it makes for a good, nice kind of little mini term paper that's very easy to read and very graphical in nature. That always helps as well. I don't know, Sarah, would you have anything to add about that, how you mix things up?
Yeah, I kind of use the 3 questions in a row rule. I learned that a long time ago in grade school, that you shouldn't have any more than like 3 questions that you ask in a row. And so I try to use that with statistics. I also try, it kind of goes back to when I say if you can find on the website, kind of figure out what your grantor is looking for. There are some grantors who statistics that's not necessarily what they want. They're more anecdotal statements, more storyline people. And then you're going to have some grantors who really thrive on statistics. They really want that data. So you just kind of need to know your funder. But I try not to do more than any more than 3 statistics in a row, and I try to kind of mingle them throughout the narrative as well.
Great suggestion.
Yeah, and related on this topic of statistics, are there any sources of data that you would advise people to avoid, like sources that wouldn't be acceptable? Should they limit themselves to like government and you know, published newspaper or journal sources?
I would use yourself as the main reference. If you're skeptical, when you read something and you're skeptical of the source, then your grant reviewer is going to be as well. The more reputable the source, the better off you're going to be. So if you quote an article from the New York Times, that's great. If you quote an article from some scandalous, questionable website type of thing, well, I may tend not to believe that. So you really just kind of have to use common sense with that. And the rule of thumb is the more reputable the source of your information, the better off you are with the grant reviewer.
Okay, great. We've got a ton more questions. I'm going to turn back to Tyler to see if we have anybody on the phone at this point.
I'm showing no questions in the queue at this time. Again, for phone participants, that is *1 if you'd like to ask a question.
All right, no worries. We'll keep going here. So Nicole asked a question more around the whole proposal writing process. She says, do you have any advice for keeping project partners on the same timeline as the grant writer? On projects I've worked on, getting our partners to provide the information or the documents they need to submit on time has been the hardest part. And she added a frowny face.
Yeah, I bet she did. That's a tough one. Well, I'll tell you my experience. I always lie about the deadline. I always say the deadline's like 2 weeks earlier than it's supposed to be. But I usually get caught after a few times of doing that, and everybody has my number and they just do what they want. That's a people management issue, and you just really, with grant writing, I guess I've always been one of those guys that never waited to the last minute, and I know a lot of people do. That is really risky because anything that can go wrong is probably going to go wrong. And if you build yourself a lot of time in there, you're just going to be safe. Well, you might accept that premise, but your project partners, as you mentioned, may not. You just have to be the taskmaster. You have to be the leader, and you have to tell everybody that this is due by 4 p.m. on this date, and if it's not, you're going to have to answer up. And that's how I've always done it. Just really set hard and fast deadlines that give me plenty of buffer that allow for lots of errors and changes and things of that nature. It's difficult to do, and yes, I've been up burning the midnight oil many times, submitting that grant at the last minute, but I hate that, and I try not to do it as often as possible.
I've had issues with that too. I've had success with creating what is known as a memorandum of understanding, and some people call that an MOU. And in it, I detail the things that the other organization will provide, whether it be data, whether it be a service, and I will also include the date. And then that gets sent as an attachment in the grant proposal. I think sometimes individuals may feel it a bit more weighty if they know that what they have promised has actually been seen by the grantor versus is just in-house. I also do the trick that Dennis does. You know, if I know it's due in 2 weeks, I ask for it, you know, ahead of time because, you know, it's a nonprofit world. We all wear different hats. We've got so many things that we're juggling that it's easy to let a deadline creep up on you. So if you can, you know, ask a few weeks out for something when it's due.
great. And Sarah Jordan, another question for you.
Okay.
Back, I think, in your first group of tips and ideas, you talked about using the grant maker's verbiage in your letter of intent or in your proposal.
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more of that? Because someone asked, Sandra asked, wouldn't that be like a form of plagiarism?
No, no, a form of plagiarism, you're going to have to copy entire paragraphs. Basically what you're showing is that you have read their mission, you know what they're all about, and that you're ready to come support their mission with what you're doing in your hometown. So I don't think that, 3 words is plagiarism. For goodness sakes, if a lot of us have the same, a lot of children's museums have very similar missions, but they're not all, that doesn't mean they're plagiarized. So no, I don't think it's plagiarism, but it will ensure, it will notify the grantor that you have read their giving detail, you've read what they want to give to, you've read their mission and what they support, and it really just shows that you took initiative.
I would add on the plagiarism side, this is a very cut and paste sort of field. It's okay if you write up, like I mentioned, the final steps here, an introduction, a needs assessment, any kind of documentation that your nonprofit owns, it's okay to cut and paste that and use in a proposal and several proposals. I mean, you own that, and you can adjust it a little bit, or please, make it more business-centric for a grant and less fundraising. But absolutely, I've been asked that several times if it's plagiarism, if you use your own marketing or former proposals or LOIs over and over again, and it's not. It's perfectly okay.
Okay, great. So next we have a question about the evaluation section. Jen says, I work with an organization serving as a community center for inner city kids. My organization has said multiple times that the evaluation of success is difficult to gauge because one child's success may be very different from that of another child. What do we do?
Well, I think in any evaluation, you're gonna reap more fundraising dollars if you're creative in your approach. Most people see the evaluation section as kind of boring. You have to collect data or whatever the case may be. But I've always used it as a way to be very creative. And I think that you can still show knowledge gains or whatever it is that you're trying to show by individual child. I know that that would be tough to say, like, for instance, we want to show a 10% increase in every child or a 5% because every child is different. But you have to do that. You have to come up with a way to measure either individually as a group or both. And if you have the opportunity to speak with a funder before you're funded, and that funder gives you advice on how to form your proposal, this would be a very good way to get closer to them and say, look, this is the difficulty we have with our evaluation. What would you recommend? And then just put a creative spin on it however you can. I don't know if that's really answering your question. It's very difficult to, when you have individuals to evaluate, but there's always a way, and it's best to consult with your funder as well to see if they have a specific way. I think Sarah mentioned in one of her grant proposals that she did not get, that she learned that the funder wanted a third-party evaluation and not their own evaluation. That obviously would have been good to know up front. So it's a good conversation to have.
I agree with Dennis. I think the more creative you can be, the better, and also consult with the agency. I can give an example from my own work. There is a financial literacy program I am responsible for compiling the reports for. It's a family literacy program, and so it's easier to check in with the adults, do a pre-assessment and a post-assessment on the adults. But for some of the children, it's not so easy. Some of the children are not native English speakers, and so we can't always communicate with them to the best. We communicate with them to the best of our ability, but we can't always communicate with them as much as we need. While we have translators, it's still sometimes difficult. So our program director came up with a unique way to test these children to see what they had gained, and it's through drawing. She has them draw what they learn. and we submit that to the grantor, and they loved it. They could clearly see in the beginning when the children would offer drawings about what it means to create a savings account. The children kind of, they would draw a bank. They didn't really know about it, but now they're drawing a bank, and they're drawing people that go in the bank and that they drop off the money. So that was a creative way to assess these children and know that they have had knowledge gained throughout this program.
Great example.
Great. Nice examples. We're nearing the end of our time, but we do have time for a few more questions. So Tyler, one more check for the phones.
Still no questions on the phone.
Okay, great. I just want to say we won't be able to get to all of the questions. There are a really wide range of topics, some of them not specific to the actual proposal writing. So I'm going to just focus our next couple of questions on the proposal, since that's what this session is all about. So Karen asks, great question, in the methods section, does this correlate to the logic model that we're using in our VISTA project? Would this be the place to include the logic model?
Oh, that's a good one for Sarah, I think.
Yes, I found that the logic model did fit pretty well with the methods section. However, the logic model can also inform your entire proposal. It can inform how you do evaluations as well. If you work backwards on the logic model, that's what I found to help me write the proposals.
Great, and it could even take you all the way back to your needs statement as well, right?
Yeah, that's what I loved. I love filling out the logic model and then using it to help inform how I write, because like I said, you can work through it. It's pretty much got every component that you would need for a grant. And it also just reminded me when I got frustrated with grant writing, because we always will. It kind of reminded me why I was writing this grant to begin with.
All right. And Sarah asks, how do you write a proposal geared for general support of an organization as opposed to a specific project? Should data be geared toward research done by the organization itself? And what about the objectives?
Yeah, that's, first of all, you have to find an organization that will offer you general support. These days, they are fewer and fewer. If you are lucky enough to find someone that does that, then yes, you will want to incorporate your organization's goals and objectives. What are they generally, rather than obviously a specific program? So generally, you might be trying to reduce homelessness by 10% in your community, and you can form objectives around that, and you can ask for general support around that. I would still try to be somewhat specific. If you're asking for general support, well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean you're going to pay salaries? If that's the case, then you should state that. Don't be afraid of that word. If you're going to buy a vehicle or some vehicles with it, you should state that. I would never just ask for general support as if it were money that's just going to go into a pot and we're just going to spend it. But if it was general support, I would be specific, and I would incorporate the already formulated goals and objectives of my overall organization.
Great. And then for our last question, sort of several people have talked about this in a couple different ways or asked about it. So Dennis, when you were talking about responding to the funder or a reactive grant opportunity, you were all about following instructions, and even in the little poll questions like, well, should we call? Well, no, if they didn't say to call, just submit the proposal. And then Sarah Jordan, when you were talking about your tips, you shared the success you had with introducing yourself to the funder or calling. And so the question is it good form to call and introduce yourself to a funder before submitting your proposal? Sort of like introducing yourself to the college dean before you apply? So what do you think?
Well, I'm gonna answer that, and then I'm interested in hearing what Sarah has to say. But in my experience, if you have an opportunity to speak to someone at a conference or even picking up the phone, if there's a phone number in your grant research that you discover, then yeah, by all means, if it's not going to be a problem for them or for you, pick up the phone and just say, hey, my name's Dennis, and I think that our philanthropic goals match each other, but what do you think? This is what I'd like to do. Just a very, very brief conversation, and then don't be a pest and call all the time. But on your larger organizations, the ones that are more established and that have people hundreds of people that go through their grant competitions or their quarterly grant cycles. You can imagine how many phone calls they do not want to get. So you need to follow their instructions specifically. And a lot of times when you're doing grant research, they will say, do not call us, email us, or send an LOI. But again, if you have the opportunity, make it, because people, again, in this small philanthropic world, you can develop a very positive reputation, and that comes through face-to-face communications. That's always the best.
Great. And Sarah Jordan, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Dennis. I think it's great to introduce yourself. I was recently at a symphony, the local symphony had a performance, and I saw the director of a granting organization that we intend to apply for a grant from, and I did not leave that hall that night until I had introduced myself. That way the following week I could send an email saying, hi, this is Sarah Jordan Holcomb. We met at the Symphony Hall. I'm drafting our letter of intent, or I'm drafting our proposal, and I had this question. That way there's kind of that face with a name, there's that connection, but also certainly don't, as Dennis said, don't keep calling them. I really meant that just like if you had a question for clarification, if you weren't sure about what research they accepted, or if for some reason you had a question about the contents of the grant. It's just a very specific question. That's what I intended that to be for.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for your participation today, and particularly our speakers, Dennis Norris and Sarah Jordan Holcomb. We're out of time today, but I do want to invite you to our webinar next month. It's on using the Siegel AmeriCorps Education Award. That'll be January 21st, 2 p.m. Eastern. So we hope to see all of you there. Thanks again for your participation.